Today, we're diving into one of the most chaotic periods in American history, 1968 to 1980. It was a time of huge social change and political crisis that honestly changed everything.
So how exactly does a third-rate burglary bring down a president? And is it true that some activists tried to get a pig named Pegasus elected president? Yep, we're going to get into all of it. The key names, dates, and causes you'll need to know.
Okay, here's our roadmap. We'll start with a fractured society, move into Nixon's presidency, talk about Vietnam, Watergate, and then wrap up with Jimmy Carter.
So, in the late 1960s, the idea of one unified America really started to fall apart. Young people, in particular, began to question everything, and it led to this huge clash of cultures.
You've probably heard of hippies, right? Well, this was their time. They were all about rejecting the old rules. Patriotism, materialism, you name it. They embraced peace, freedom, and new lifestyles, and it all came together at the iconic Woodstock Festival in 1969.
With that dream of a unified society fading, different groups started to focus on their own specific struggles. That's the core of identity politics. People organizing around their shared identity, whether it's race, gender, or orientation, to fight for their own rights.
A great example of this was the American Indian Movement, or AM. So who founded AM? Dennis Banks was a key founder in 1968. They organized to fight back against years of poverty and broken promises. They made headlines with bold protests like taking over Alcatraz Island and the standoff at Wounded Knee, all to demand their land back and for their treaties to be honored.
And it wasn't just AIM. Other major movements were exploding onto the scene. The Stonewall riots in 1969 really kicked off the modern gay rights movement. At the same time, the women's liberation movement was fighting for things like equal pay and reproductive rights. Their biggest legal win? That was Roe v. Wade in 1973, the Supreme Court case that legalized first-trimester abortion.
Okay, so remember, these deep social and cultural divides weren't just talk. They sparked powerful new political movements. And that turmoil was about to get a huge reaction from the political world.
All that chaos in 1968 really hurt the Democratic Party, and that created a perfect opening for Republican Richard Nixon, who spoke directly to a whole different group of Americans.
I mean, the Democrats were literally tearing themselves apart over the Vietnam War. Their convention in Chicago was a total mess, with riots breaking out. The party was fractured, their candidate was weakened, and it handed Richard Nixon a pretty clean win.
So who did Nixon appeal to? He called them the silent majority. What does that mean? Well, these were your northern, blue-collar voters who were pretty nervous about all the protests and social changes. Nixon's simple promise of law and order was exactly what they wanted to hear, and it got him elected.
Nixon's presidency is really a tale of two different stories. At home, the economy was a mess. He was dealing with something called stagflation. That's high inflation and high unemployment. A total nightmare. But in foreign policy, he made some absolutely massive moves. He eased tensions with the Soviet Union, and then, and this was huge, he visited China in 1972, completely flipping decades of American policy on its head.
Remember, Nixon got into office by speaking to voters who were tired of all the unrest, and then he completely changed the game in global politics. But for all his success abroad, there was always one huge shadow hanging over his presidency: the war in Vietnam.
Nixon promised he'd find an honorable end to the war in Vietnam. The problem was, his plan to get out first involved making the war even bigger.
So here was the strategy. On one hand, there was Vietnamization. That meant training South Vietnamese soldiers to do more of the fighting, so American troops could leave. But on the other hand, Nixon secretly authorized bombing raids and even a ground invasion of neighboring Cambodia, which was supposed to be a neutral country.
Back home, support for the war was hitting rock bottom. People were horrified by things like the My Lai massacre. So what prompted the protests at Kent State? It was Nixon's invasion of Cambodia. College campuses exploded, and tragically, at Kent State, the National Guard shot and killed 4 student protesters. Then came the Pentagon Papers, leaked documents that proved the government had been lying about the war for a long, long time.
Remember, the brutality of the war and the government's lies finally turned most Americans against it, forcing the U.S. to pull out. But just as the country was dealing with the fallout from Vietnam, a completely different crisis was starting to brew, one that would bring down the president himself.
It turns out, President Nixon was obsessed with his political enemies, and that obsession led his team to commit crimes that snowballed into the Watergate scandal, a nightmare that would shake America to its core.
It all started with a simple break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building. But the burglary wasn't the real problem. The cover-up was. Over the next 2 years, investigators unraveled this whole network of illegal dirty tricks. And the smoking gun? A secret taping system in the White House that recorded everything. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned in August 1974.
So Gerald Ford becomes president and says, our long national nightmare is over. But then, just a month in, he pardons Richard Nixon for all his crimes. People were outraged. It was a hugely unpopular decision. Ford did continue Nixon's foreign policy, though, signing the important Helsinki Accords with the Soviet Union.
Remember, Watergate proved that no one, not even the president, is above the law. But it also left Americans feeling deeply cynical and distrustful of their own government.
After all that, Americans were desperate for a leader they could trust. So in 1976, they elected a total outsider, Jimmy Carter. He was a former governor of Georgia, and his main promise was simple: I will never lie to you.
Carter actually had some incredible successes, especially in foreign policy. He brokered the Camp David Accords, a peace deal between Egypt and Israel that people thought was impossible. But at home, he was stuck with the same economic problems, stagflation and an energy crisis. And then came the one thing that defined his presidency, the Iran hostage crisis. For 444 days, 52 Americans were held hostage. It was on the news every single night, and it just made the whole country feel powerless.
Remember, Carter's presidency just couldn't overcome the bad economy and the hostage crisis. It set the stage for yet another big political shift. The country was exhausted and looking for a new path forward.
Okay, let's do a super fast final review. These are the must-knows. One of AIM's founders was Dennis Banks. Roe v. Wade from 1973 legalized first trimester abortions. Nixon's big foreign policy move was visiting China in 1972. His silent majority were those moderate blue-collar voters. The Kent State protests, they were a reaction to the U.S. invading Cambodia. President Ford signed the Helsinki Accords. Jimmy Carter's big promise was that he would never lie. And Watergate all started with a break-in at the DNC headquarters.
So, from the counterculture and Vietnam to Watergate and the crises that followed, the events of these few years really did change America, and they're still shaping our world today.